In the spring of 1970, on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a psychologist named Harry Harlow ordered his lab technicians to build a steel chamber shaped like an inverted pyramid, its walls smooth and sloping so nothing could climb out. He called it, without apparent irony, the pit of despair. Baby rhesus monkeys were placed inside alone, sometimes for weeks, and left to rock, scream, and eventually go still. The man behind this device had spent the previous decade insisting, against the scientific consensus of his time, that love was real, that it could be measured, and that its absence could be engineered in a laboratory. The question that hangs over Harry Harlow's career, and over this whole unsettling corner of 20th century science, is how a researcher chasing evidence for something as tender as affection ended up building machines to destroy it. To understand why Harlow did what he did, you have to understand what he was fighting. American psychology in the 1940s and 50s was dominated by behaviorism, the school of thought associated with John B. Watson, which treated love, affection, and emotional bonds as sentimental nonsense, with no place in a rigorous science of behavior. Watson had gone so far as to warn parents against too much kissing and cuddling, worried it would create weak, dependent adults. Infants, in this view, attached to their mothers mainly because mothers supplied food. Comfort had nothing to do with it. Harlow, a restless, ambitious, and famously blunt-spoken researcher who had built his career studying learning in monkeys, found this idea not just wrong, but almost insulting to plain observation. He had a temperament suited to a fight. Theatrical in lectures, quick with a cutting line, impatient with academic caution, and by his own later admission, increasingly dependent on alcohol as his personal life frayed. He wanted proof, and he wanted it in a form no behaviorist could wave away. The proof came in 1958 in an address to the American Psychological Association that Harlow titled, provocatively, The Nature of Love. He described an experiment that has since become one of the most reproduced images in the history of psychology. Infant rhesus monkeys, separated from their biological mothers shortly after birth, were given a choice between two artificial surrogates. One was a bare wire frame fitted with a bottle that supplied milk. The other was a similar frame wrapped in soft terry cloth, offering no food at all. If behaviorism were correct, the monkeys should have bonded with whichever surrogate fed them. Instead, they clung to the cloth mother for most of the day, running to her when frightened, and visiting the wire mother only long enough to feed before hurrying back to the softer, comforting shape. Harlow had built a piece of evidence that a generation of psychologists could not easily dismiss. Contact and comfort mattered on their own terms, independent of food, and their absence produced visible distress. It was elegant, it was clear, and it landed like a hammer. But Harlow did not stop at demonstrating comfort. He escalated, and this is where his personality and his science become inseparable from the discomfort modern audiences feel watching the footage. Working with a series of graduate students and collaborators, most notably Stephen Suomi, who would later run his own influential primate lab, Harlow began isolating infant monkeys completely, denying them any surrogate at all, then measuring how badly they broke. Monkeys raised in total isolation for the first 6 months of life emerged unable to interact normally with other monkeys ever again. They rocked obsessively, bit themselves, and when placed with peers, they were often attacked or simply withdrew into corners. The pit of despair was the most extreme version of this work, a chamber designed specifically to induce what Harlow, again with characteristic bluntness, called a state resembling human clinical depression. He wanted to know not just that isolation harmed monkeys, but exactly how much harm a nervous system could absorb before it broke permanently, and whether that breaking could be reversed. It is worth pausing on what was happening in Harlow's own life while this research intensified, because the man does not fit neatly into either the villain or the visionary category that later commentators tried to force him into. His first wife, Clara Mears, had been a gifted psychologist herself, and their marriage ended in divorce, partly because Harlow poured himself into the lab at the expense of nearly everything else. His second wife, Margaret Quinn Harlow, was a developmental psychologist and a genuine intellectual partner who helped shape the direction of the isolation studies before her death from cancer in 1971. Colleagues and biographers, including later ones who interviewed his surviving associates, describe a man who became visibly depressed and increasingly reliant on alcohol after her death, who was hospitalized for depression himself in the years that followed, and who kept working anyway, driven by something that looked less like scientific curiosity and more like compulsion. There is a genuine and disturbing irony sitting at the center of this story. The researcher who proved, more forcefully than anyone before him, that isolation and emotional deprivation damage a mind, spent the final act of his own career, isolated by grief, running experiments that inflicted exactly the wound he had spent his life describing. The consequences of Harlow's work split in two directions, and both are still with us. On one side, his research became foundational evidence for attachment theory, the framework developed by the British psychiatrist John Bowlby, who cited Harlow's monkeys directly when arguing that children in hospitals and orphanages needed consistent physical affection, not just efficient feeding schedules. Hospital policies that once separated sick children from their parents for most of the day began to change through the 1960s and 70s, and while Bowlby's own observational studies of institutionalized children did much of that persuasive work, Harlow's stark animal evidence gave reformers something a skeptical medical establishment found hard to dismiss. On the other side, as the footage of rocking, self-biting, isolated monkeys circulated more widely in later decades, Harlow became a case study cited by the animal rights movement as an example of research whose cruelty outpaced its necessity. Critics, including some of his own former students, later argued that by the 1960s the basic point about comfort and attachment had already been made, and that the escalating isolation experiments told science little it didn't already suspect, at a steep and visible cost to the animals involved. Harlow, for his part, never really apologized. He argued, until his death in 1981, that the suffering of a relatively small number of monkeys had produced knowledge that changed how millions of human children were raised. Whether that trade was worth making is still argued in psychology courses today, which is itself part of his uncomfortable legacy. This is the pattern this whole documentary is built around. A genuine advance in human understanding purchased through documented deliberate suffering and the discomfort of knowing both facts are true at once. Not every disturbing discovery in this period came from a laboratory full of animals. Some came from ordinary people sitting in a plain room at Yale University, believing they were helping with a study on memory and learning, while a very different question was actually being tested. In the summer of 1961, a young social psychologist named Stanley Milgram set up a series of experiments in the basement of Yale's Lindsley Chittenden Hall that would become, for better and worse, one of the most famous studies in the history of psychology. Milgram had trained under Solomon Asch, the psychologist famous for showing how easily people conform to group pressure, and he had a personal reason for wanting to push that question further. He was Jewish, deeply engaged with the ongoing trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, and haunted by a question that Eichmann's own defense had raised in the courtroom, that he was simply following orders. Milgram wanted to know whether ordinary Americans, given a legitimate seeming authority figure and a lab coat, would inflict serious harm on another person simply because they were told to. The design was deceptively simple, and Milgram, by every account a meticulous and theatrical experimenter who enjoyed staging his studies, almost like productions, built it with real craft. A volunteer was told he was participating in a study on learning, paired with another participant who was actually an actor, James McDonough, working for Milgram. The volunteer was assigned the role of teacher, the actor, the role of learner, seated in another room and wired apparently to receive electric shocks whenever he answered a memory test incorrectly. The shocks were not real, but the volunteer had no way of knowing that. As the test proceeded, the actor's recorded protests grew louder and more desperate, escalating to screams and eventually silence, while a stern experimenter in a grey lab coat stood beside the volunteer, calmly instructing them to continue whenever they hesitated. How far would an ordinary person go, simply because someone in authority told them the experiment required it? The unsettling answer, published in his 1963 paper in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, was that most did not refuse at all. In his original experiment, roughly 65% of participants continued all the way to the maximum voltage, believing they might be seriously harming or even killing the man in the other room, simply because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required it. What makes Milgram's personality central to this story is not just the design, but how he handled what he found. If you're finding these stories as unsettling as we do, that discomfort is exactly the point of returning to them carefully, which is why we've put real research into this series, Predicted CTA Sentence 01. He was, by the recollection of colleagues and his own extensive notes, both scientifically rigorous and something of a showman, someone who filmed his sessions, later turning footage into the documentary Obedience, and who clearly understood the dramatic power of what he had captured. He was also notably disturbed by his own results. Milgram had expected, and told colleagues he expected, that only a small fraction of Americans would go all the way. He ran variations for years afterward, changing the physical distance between teacher and learner, changing who gave the orders, testing whether the presence of a defiant peer would embolden other participants to refuse, trying to understand the conditions that produced obedience rather than simply proving it existed. This was not a man who stumbled into a shocking result and moved on. He spent much of the rest of his career interrogating it. The professional cost to Milgram was real and immediate. A fellow psychologist, Diana Baumrind, published a sharp critique in 1964, arguing that Milgram had deceived his subjects and exposed them to serious, lasting psychological distress without adequate protections, comparing the ethical breach to using human subjects as means to an end rather than treating them as people whose well-being mattered. The American Psychological Association investigated, and while it ultimately allowed Milgram's membership to stand, the controversy followed him for the rest of his career. Harvard, where he had studied and hoped eventually to hold a permanent position, denied him tenure in 1963, a decision several historians of psychology have linked at least partly to the discomfort his methods generated among senior colleagues, though Milgram himself and others also pointed to the ordinary politics of academic hiring. He ended up at the City University of New York, where he continued working, developing the small world experiments that gave us the now famous idea of 6 degrees of separation, before dying of a heart attack in 1984 at only 51. The obedience studies remain both required reading and a case study in research ethics gone wrong, cited every time a university ethics board debates what deception a researcher can ethically ask a volunteer to walk into. If Harlow's monkeys and Milgram's volunteers raise hard questions about consent and cruelty, the longest-running and arguably most disturbing case in this history involved no elaborate deception at all, just decades of quiet bureaucratic neglect dressed up as science. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute in Macon County, Alabama, launched a study designed to track the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. The study's early architect was a physician named Taliaferro Clark, who framed it initially as a short-term project examining a disease that was, at the time, poorly understood and difficult to treat effectively anyway. What Clark started, however, outlived him by decades, carried forward by successors including Raymond Vonderlehr and later public health service physicians who kept the study running long after treatment became widely available. Roughly 600 black men were enrolled, about 2/3 of them already infected with syphilis, the rest serving as an uninfected comparison group. None were told they had syphilis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague, locally understood term, and given aspirin, vitamins, and occasional actual medical care for other conditions, enough to keep them participating without meaningfully treating the disease that was slowly damaging their hearts, nervous systems, and organs. The person whose role complicates any simple villain narrative here is Eunice Rivers, a black nurse who worked on the study almost from its beginning until it ended. Nearly 40 years later, Rivers was not a distant bureaucrat. She visited the men's homes, knew their families, arranged their transportation to checkups, and by most accounts genuinely believed she was helping her community by keeping men connected to whatever medical attention the study provided. Historians who have examined her role, including in later oral history interviews, describe a woman operating inside a segregated medical system with very few black doctors and almost no institutional power of her own, who trusted the white physicians running the study to know what they were doing, and who became in effect the human bridge that kept the study functioning for decades by maintaining the participants' trust. That trust was the study's most valuable resource, and it was built on a lie the men never had the power to question. The most damning turn came after 1947, when penicillin became widely available and was already recognized as a fast, effective cure for syphilis. Rather than treat the men, the Public Health Service made a deliberate decision to continue withholding it, arguing that the study's scientific value in tracking the disease's natural course outweighed the ethical obligation to treat men who were, by then unknowing, subjects of a decades-old deception. Physicians associated with the study, including John Cutler, who later became infamous for his separate role directing deliberately infectious syphilis experiments on prisoners and mental patients in Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, moved through a public health career in which the withholding of informed consent from vulnerable populations was treated as an acceptable cost of medical knowledge. The study continued until 1972, when a public health service venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton, who had raised internal objections as early as 1966, only to be dismissed by his superiors, leaked the story to the press. Journalist Jean Heller broke the story for the Associated Press that July, and the public reaction was immediate and furious. By then, dozens of the men had died of syphilis or its complications, wives had been infected, and children had been born with congenital syphilis, all while the study's own physicians tracked the damage as data rather than intervening as doctors. The aftermath reshaped American research ethics in ways still visible today. A congressional hearing led to the 1974 National Research Act, which established the institutional review boards that now oversee virtually all human research in the United States, and to the Belmont Report of 1979, which laid out the basic ethical principles: respect for persons, informed consent, and justice in the selection of research subjects that govern biomedical research to this day. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the study's 8 surviving participants at a White House ceremony, calling what had happened deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. Picture that ceremony. Elderly men, the last survivors of a 40-year experiment, standing in the East Room as a sitting president apologized on camera for something their own government had done to them before most viewers watching this were even born. But the study's legacy runs deeper than policy documents. It left a documented, lasting distrust of medical institutions in many Black American communities, a wariness that researchers and public health officials have had to reckon with directly in later decades, including during vaccination campaigns, because it was earned rather than imagined. What connects Harry Harlow's isolation chambers, Stanley Milgram's shock generator, and the decades of quiet withholding in Macon County is not a single villain or a single moral lesson, but a pattern worth sitting with. In each case, the scientists involved were not cartoonish monsters detached from ordinary human motivation. They were ambitious, often genuinely convinced they were serving a larger good, embedded in institutions that rewarded boldness and discouraged internal dissent, and surrounded by collaborators, nurses, students, and technicians whose smaller daily choices to comply, to question, to leak, to keep quiet, shaped the outcome just as much as any single principal investigator's decision did. Harlow believed he was proving that love was real science. Milgram believed he was warning humanity about the machinery of atrocity. The physicians in Alabama believed, for a while at least, that watching a disease unfold untreated served medical knowledge more than treating it would. That is, the uncomfortable, recurring truth this history keeps handing us. The most disturbing discoveries were rarely about what nature was willing to reveal. They were about what scientists, under pressure, ambition, and the conviction of their own good intentions, were willing to do to find out.